you all for being here, and without further ado, I turn it over to Helen Alvarez.
Okay, thank you so much.
Let's give her a hand.
Okay, hi, my name is Helen. I'm part of the Honors Thesis program here at St. Edward's, and the title of my thesis is Praying for an A, How College Students' Anxiety is Impacted by Prayer and Attachment Styles. So let's jump into the introduction. Okay, so anxiety, a word some of us are a little bit too familiar with. So anxiety symptoms have been seen to be historically high and continue to rise among college students. And this is quite an issue because it impacts them in various ways. And so various studies and surveys have found that this has been prevalent among the last few decades, and especially within the last decade even. So in order to try to mitigate this issue or reduce it, some researchers have proposed that prayer, which is communication with a higher being, could potentially help reduce some of these anxiety symptoms. And a lot of studies have actually found that private prayer has a significant reduction in anxiety symptoms, and more specifically among university students, which is great to hear. However, there has been a little bit of variance among the results. So a few studies have actually found that prayer will sometimes cause an increase in anxiety symptoms or have no significant impact on college students' anxiety symptoms. And so in order to try to understand this variance, some researchers have thought that maybe adding in the variable of what's called attachment styles could help explain why there's like some students who are experiencing more anxiety symptoms or lower anxiety symptoms or no significance when doing prayer. And so to explain, attachment styles are essentially behaviors and emotional reactions which one individual has with another in a relationship. And so there's 4 categories: secure, anxious, avoidant, and fearful. And for my thesis, I'll be specifically focusing on the anxious and avoidant attachment style. And so to try to explain this, I'll give an example. So between a parent and a child, we could say that the child has like a secure relationship with their mom in which they feel like very loved by the mom, and they feel secure, and they feel that they can trust their mom. And so researchers have actually found that with prayer and these attachment styles, individuals who have a secure attachment style with God actually experience lower amounts of anxiety symptoms, while those who have an anxious, avoidant, or fearful attachment style to God and pray have a higher amount of anxiety symptoms. So now jumping into my research questions. So my first research question is, how do the different attachments to God impact the amount of anxiety symptoms college students experience? And then my second question is, how do the different frequencies of prayer, as in if they pray a lot or a little, impact the amount of anxiety symptoms college students experience? And so for my first hypothesis, I hypothesize that students with more of an anxious and avoidant attachment to God experience higher anxiety symptoms, just as a lot of literature has found. And then for my second hypothesis, I hypothesize that students who pray more have lower anxiety symptoms. And so here's a little model to try to explain what I'm looking into with all of the variables. So first, I'm looking at anxious attachment, which a student has, and how it relates to their anxiety symptoms, whether it's like a lot or a little. And then I'm looking at prayer and how it moderates this outcome or effect and has an impact on either if it leads to more or less anxiety symptoms. And then here's the same model, but with an avoidant attachment, which a student would have with God. So for my methods, I created a survey which looked at these variables, so how much a student prays, their anxiety symptoms, if they have an anxious or avoidant attachment, and I got 82 responses. Participants had to be students at St. Edward's University and had to be over the age of 18. And if they took the survey, they were able to enter a raffle to win one of 3 $50 gift cards. So, yeah. So here are some demographics. So the ages were between 18 to 29 of the people who took the survey. with the average/mean being 20 years of age. And then for the gender, all of that red is women, so we had 79% be women. And then for the religious affiliation, all of that blue that we see there is Christians, which was a majority portion, and then a smaller portion was agnostic with a 16.5%. And then for racial/ethnic background, all of that yellow we see here is Hispanics with a 57.7%. And then the second biggest was white individuals with a 24.7%. So for the questionnaires, so in my survey, there was 4 different types of questionnaires/measures which assessed students' anxiety symptoms within the past 2 weeks, their avoidant attachment or anxious attachment if applicable, and then their prayer frequency. And so in the bullet points, I have some examples of some of the questions that I had to assess these things. So for example, anxiety symptoms, they would be asked, within the past 2 weeks, how often have you felt nervous, anxious, or on edge? And for avoidant, God seems to have little or no interest in my personal problems. And then they would say whether they highly disagree or highly agree and choose between that. And then for anxious, God seems to be very warm, but other times very cold to me. And then for prayer frequency, we had one question, and that was, how often have you spent time alone in prayer outside of religious services? All right, so now moving on to the results. Okay, so this is a correlations graph. This is essentially looking at all of those variables, the prayer frequency, anxiety symptoms, avoidant attachment, anxious attachment, and seeing how all of those variables independently relate to one another and if there's a significant impact between those. So I'll point out the ones that were significant just to make it easy to understand. So the yellow circle on the left is showing us that students who had an avoidant attachment with God had lower levels of anxiety symptoms, which was an interesting finding. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. And then the top yellow circle on the right shows us that students who had an avoidant attachment with God prayed more often, which is also very interesting to me. And then the circle here at the bottom right showed that students who prayed more had lower anxiety symptoms. Okay, so this is the anxious attachment and prayer graph. So this graph was essentially looking at prayer, anxious attachment, and anxiety symptoms, and seeing how prayer and attachment with the anxious attachment to God would impact anxiety symptoms. And we found that when all of those variables were sort of interconnected together, and we ran the analysis, there was no significance found. So the number was too small to say there was a strong relationship between those variables altogether. And then same thing with the avoidant attachment and prayer. Students who had an avoidant attachment and prayed, those variables together didn't have a significant impact on their anxiety symptoms, as in whether it was high or low. We couldn't see a direct correlation, so there was no significance. All right, so circling back to my hypotheses and research question, I had first hypothesized that students who had an anxious or avoidant attachment with God would have higher levels of anxiety symptoms, and this was not supported. As we saw in the previous graphs, there was no significance. So I believe that it may have been possibly due to the fact that other factors in those students' lives may be more impactful. So maybe their environment, their home environment, maybe there's a lot of negative stimuli or things happening which is having a larger impact on their anxiety symptoms as opposed to their attachment to God. And then for the other important finding that we found was how students who had an avoidance attachment with God had less anxiety and prayed more, which was the one that was interesting to me. So I believe that that may be due to the fact that students may be depending on self-reliance and having their own coping strategies. So even though they have an avoidant attachment with God, they have other strategies that they're using, which is leading to those the reduction or lesser anxiety symptoms overall that they have. And then another thing that I wanted to point out, so the survey was given between mid-October to the end of October. So there was like a lot of like anxiety-inducing things happening. So there was midterms for students, and then there was like presidential run stuff. So there was a lot of anxiety happening around that time. So it may have also led to, I believe, potentially like students who maybe have an avoidance attachment with God, now seeking out more prayer amidst this anxiety. And then for my second hypothesis, I had hypothesized that students who pray more have lower anxiety symptoms, which was supported, which is great to hear. And then my last point, so prayer can be an efficient coping strategy, as we see. Despite the first hypothesis not being supported, we do see in a lot of studies, and including in this survey, that prayer is very beneficial to university students. It's very flexible, accessible, it's low of cost, which is really important because a lot of students seek resources which maybe aren't that expensive, and a lot of students have very busy lives, so it's important to give them tools which are accessible and that they can use in various ways, and which are like very adaptable and flexible to them. Okay, so my limitations and further research. So limitations, my sample size was relatively small, so I had 82 participants, and usually the ideal amount is a minimal of 100 participants, so that may have changed some things in the results, and that's also why I couldn't do the 4 attachment styles, and I only chose 2 of them because the sample was a little bit small. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the timing. So I did the survey between mid-October, end of October, and all of that anxiety may have like changed some of the results as well. And then for further research, so I proposed that more studies be done with larger and more diverse samples, just seeing that the demographics had like large portions of like certain groups. So it may be more interesting to see larger and more diversity in those, with the same like study being done with the attachments and prayer. And then diagnostic evaluations. So it'd be interesting to ask students directly like how they feel their attachments to God and prayer impact their anxiety symptoms, and then just analyzing those responses to see just in what ways do those attachments to God and prayer impact their anxiety symptoms. And then it would be really interesting also just to see how these 2 things, the attachments and prayer, impact the general population of young adults, just because anxiety is not just among college students, of course, it's among the general population, as studies have shown, especially in the United States and especially among young adults. And these studies are like really needed because, well, anxiety is, sometimes it can feel like a trap and it can feel very limiting. So, yeah, thank you.
To questions and comments from our audience.
Yes.
So I thought the idea of looking at attachment to God was really interesting. I was curious whether you had to make up those questionnaire items or whether you actually found a validated questionnaire. Because I think that as a follow-up, I was curious if there was past research at all on the idea of attachment to God, and if it like, I'm thinking of like in the attachment literature, sometimes the theory is that people who are like more anxiously attached to their parents might then later become more anxiously attached to romantic partners or friends. And so I guess I was wondering if that carries over into like a spiritual relationship, like if it overlaps with other types of attachments at all, I guess.
Yeah, great question. So to answer the first question, I did get measures from some previous studies that have been done, just because there is a few studies that have looked into these attachment styles, particularly in someone's relationship with God. They're just very few, so those are the ones I transferred over and used for my survey. And then I used the GAD-7 to assess anxiety symptoms. And then I also used their one question on prayer frequency to assess that. But yeah, it's definitely something that individual researchers are looking into to see how attachment styles can translate over to someone's relationship with not just God, but like other higher beings among religions. So, yeah. yeah, it's starting to become something more big. Any other questions? Yes.
Did you do any covariate analysis on individuals who are Christian versus agnostic and how that would impact the data? Or is that, I know your sample size is very small and that would make it hard to do subset analysis, but I'm just curious what subsets of the data you think would be interesting to look at and what you might hypothesize to find.
Yeah, definitely individuals of other religions who believe in other higher beings. That would be really interesting just because individuals maybe sometimes don't engage in prayer, but other practices as well with their higher being. And so it'd be interesting to see how they feel at those behaviors with their higher being would impact their anxiety symptoms. So, because I know there's other things like meditation in other religions and stuff like that. So it'd be really interesting to see those things among different religions.
Is there any, did you look at if there was an impact of people who self-identified as Christian versus agnostic with their attachment style? Were you more likely to see a particular attachment style in agnostic individuals as compared to maybe more cemented in their belief system?
Yeah, so I didn't look at this specific individuals with different religions because the sample size was a little bit small, and so it would have been difficult. But I do think it's very interesting, and it should be opened up to more research because I feel like that would produce different results, especially among the relationships in the variables. So yeah, I wish I could have. Yes.
I had a question for you. First of all, I wanted to say that I thought that was just so original. You have a really insightful, original perspective, and I was very impressed with your presentation. I was curious how the people in your study, if you were able to ask them, defined praying and kind of what practices or behaviors counted as praying for them.
Yeah, so I included it in the consent form. I don't know if individuals read the consent form, but I put it as communication with God. And so, but I do know that prayer is very adaptable. So some individuals may think of it as different things, maybe just sitting in silence with the higher being. They may consider that prayer. And so it was kind of open-ended because prayer is very flexible. And so, yeah, that's...
Yeah, that's so interesting because just what you said about meditation, I was thinking about, is it something about praying to a higher power that perhaps lends itself to some of your results, or is it quiet contemplation?
Yeah.
So it's interesting to think that you had it very open. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Very interesting topic. Are you able to share what led you to choose this research area?
Oh, great question. So I'm Catholic. I've grown up Catholic. And I feel like my personal relationship with God really impacts my anxiety symptoms. So whenever I'm feeling anxious, I'll think of a specific verse, and then the verse encourages prayer. So I'll pray, and then most of the times the anxiety symptoms will just go away. And I love it, and I hope other students try it out too. And so I was curious to see if other students are also experiencing the same reduction in anxiety symptoms. So, yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Why did you hear anxiety symptoms with prayer and to God, not or just personal coping mechanisms?
Why did I choose attachment styles and prayer specifically, or? Okay. If I'm being honest, I mostly did it because I've seen a few other studies looking at this, and I was very interested to see how it applied in college students, just because those studies were looking at adults in general in the US, and so I wanted to see how that would apply in college students because college students are experiencing a lot of anxiety, and so it would have been just interesting to see how they deal with those symptoms. So yeah, that's why I chose it.
Time for one more question or comment? Anybody has one? Great. Thank you so much, Helen.
Thank you.
Great.
I I am very excited to have you all really hear about Helen's research. I've just met Helen in the last couple of months, but it's been such a pleasure to get to work with her. This research is very important, and there's research that's starting to be done, but very contributing a lot to the field, and so it's been an honor. She's been so motivated. I told her when we started, I was like, it's very ambitious to do a study in such a short amount of time. She's like, I still want to do it, and she's done an amazing job learning very tough analyses, and she's done it all, showing a lot of strength and grace in it all. So congratulations, Helen. Thank you for letting me be your advisor. And congratulations. Thank you. Yeah, of course.